The year is 1952. Behind the imposing brick walls of Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, a patient named Mary screams into the night. Her cries echo through corridors lined with peeling paint and broken dreams. She's been here for 3 years now, subjected to ice baths, insulin shock therapy, and experimental procedures that would horrify us today. Mary was just one of thousands who disappeared behind the walls of America's psychiatric institutions, places that promised healing but delivered horror. Today Mary is gone, but locals swear they still hear her screams echoing through the abandoned ruins of what was once called the Danvers Lunatic Asylum. Welcome to Nightmare Narratives, where true history bleeds into horror and the strangest legends might just be real. If you like the eerie, the unexplained, and the downright disturbing, hit like and don't forget to subscribe. Some stories are too dark to forget. Today we're stepping into the shadows of abandoned psychiatric hospitals and asylums, places where the line between the living and the dead seems impossibly thin. We'll explore why these locations have become synonymous with paranormal activity, uncover the real stories of suffering that took place within their walls, and examine whether the spirits of the past truly refuse to rest. But first, a warning. The stories we're about to tell contain discussions of historical medical abuse, neglect, and human suffering. While we'll treat these topics with respect, viewer discretion is advised. To understand why these places are so haunted, we need to go back to the beginning. The asylum system in America began with good intentions. In the 1840s, reformer Dorothea Dix championed the cause of the mentally ill, who were often chained in basements or left to wander the streets. Her efforts led to the construction of massive state hospitals designed to provide moral treatment in peaceful, rural settings. The Kirkbride Plan, developed by psychiatrist Thomas Kirkbride, became the blueprint for these institutions. These imposing Victorian structures were built like small cities, with their own farms, workshops and living quarters. From the outside, they looked almost like grand hotels or universities. But as the 19th century progressed, these hospitals became overcrowded warehouses for society's unwanted. What started as institutions for 250 patients soon housed over 2,000. The moral treatment gave way to custodial care, and custodial care gave way to something much darker. By the early 1900s, these places had transformed into something resembling medieval dungeons more than modern hospitals. Patients were packed into wards like sardines, often sleeping on floors, wearing nothing but hospital gowns year-round, and subjected to treatments that we now recognise as torture. The staff-to-patient ratios were impossibly thin. At some facilities, a single attendant might be responsible for 100 patients. With no oversight and little training, abuse became commonplace. Patients were beaten, starved, and subjected to experimental procedures without consent. And here's where our ghost stories begin to take shape. When human suffering reaches such depths, when people die forgotten and unmourned, it's no wonder that their spirits might refuse to move on. Let me tell you about Willowbrook State School on Staten Island. Though calling it a school was a cruel joke, this institution, which operated from 1947 to 1987, was supposed to care for children with intellectual disabilities. Instead, it became a chamber of horrors. In 1972, a young television reporter named Geraldo Rivera smuggled a camera inside. What he captured shocked the nation. Children naked, lying in their own filth, many showing signs of severe abuse and neglect. Some children were kept in restraints for years. Others developed hepatitis from the unsanitary conditions. Hepatitis that was actually deliberately introduced by researchers conducting illegal medical experiments. One former patient, who we'll call James to protect his privacy, spent 15 years at Willowbrook. He later testified that attendants would drag uncooperative patients to a room called the Box, a windowless cell where they were left for days without food or water. James said the screams from that room never stopped, day or night, At the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, lobotomies were performed with ice picks through the eye socket. The procedure took about 10 minutes and left patients as empty shells of their former selves. The asylum performed over 600 lobotomies, often on patients whose only crime was being difficult to manage. In the basement of this same facility, a room known as the Violent Ward housed patients who were chained to walls and left to die. Archaeologists have found scratch marks on the stone walls made by human fingernails, desperate attempts to escape that continued until the very end. Perhaps most heartbreaking is the story of Maggie, a 30-year-old woman admitted to Penhurst State School in Pennsylvania in 1908 for being incorrigible. Her crime? She had given birth to a child out of wedlock. She spent the next 60 years of her life locked away, dying at age 90, having never seen the outside world again. These weren't isolated incidents, they were the norm, and when you consider that tens of thousands of people died in these institutions, often buried in unmarked graves on the property, it becomes clear why these places feel so heavy with spiritual energy. Now, let's talk about why these places have become legendary among paranormal investigators. The short answer is, they're some of the most active haunted locations in the world. Take Danvers State Hospital, which we mentioned earlier. Built in 1878, it was designed to house 600 patients, but at its peak held over 2,000. The overcrowding led to unimaginable conditions. Patients died regularly from neglect, abuse, and failed medical experiments. The hospital finally closed in 1992, but the paranormal activity began almost immediately. Security guards reported hearing screams, seeing shadowy figures in the windows, and finding doors that had been locked mysteriously standing open. The most active area, the underground tunnel system that connected the buildings, the same tunnels where deceased patients were transported to the morgue. At the Old Traverse City State Hospital in Michigan, visitors consistently report the same phenomena: the sound of children crying in the empty pediatric ward, the feeling of being watched in the former electroshock therapy rooms, and the overwhelming sense of sadness in what was once called the disturbed ward. One of the most compelling accounts comes from Rolling Hills Asylum in New York. This facility, which operated from 1827 to 1974, has become a mecca for ghost hunters. The most famous spirit is that of Roy Crews, a patient who died in the 1940s. Multiple visitors have reported seeing a man in a white hospital gown standing at the end of the main hallway, and EVP recordings have captured a voice saying Roy in response to investigators' questions. But perhaps the most chilling location is the former Byberry Mental Hospital in Philadelphia. This place was so notorious that it was investigated by the FBI for human rights violations. Patients were found living in rooms filled with excrement, and reports of rape and murder were common. The hospital closed in 1990, but urban explorers who've entered the abandoned buildings report being physically pushed, hearing voices telling them to leave, and experiencing an overwhelming sense of dread in certain rooms, particularly the hydrotherapy room where patients were subjected to scalding hot and ice-cold water treatments. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This is all just psychological suggestion, right? People expect these places to be haunted, so they imagine things. And you know what? That's partly true. The power of suggestion is real, and these places certainly look the part of a haunted location. But there are some interesting theories about why locations with histories of intense human suffering might actually retain some form of energy. The stone tape theory, proposed by archaeologist T.C. Lethbridge, suggests that traumatic events can somehow be recorded in the environment, particularly in stone and brick structures like these old asylums. The theory goes that intense emotional energy can be absorbed by the building materials and replayed under certain conditions. While this theory isn't scientifically proven, it's worth noting that many of these institutions were built with materials that contain high levels of quartz, a mineral that's used in recording devices because of its ability to store information. There are also environmental factors to consider. Many of these buildings contain high levels of electromagnetic energy due to old electrical systems and underground tunnels. This type of energy has been linked to feelings of unease, the sensation of being watched, and even visual hallucinations. But perhaps the most compelling explanation is psychological. These places are monuments to human suffering on an unimaginable scale. When you walk through these halls knowing that thousands of people lived and died here in agony, it's natural that you'd feel their presence, whether that's actual spiritual energy or just our minds connecting with the tragedy of the past. The effect is the same. The question isn't really whether these places are haunted, it's how could they not be? The asylum system officially began to crumble in the 1960s and 70s, thanks to exposés like Geraldo Rivera's Willowbrook investigation and the development of psychiatric medications that allowed many patients to live in the community. The process was called deinstitutionalization, and while it ended the worst abuses, it also created new problems as many former patients ended up homeless or in prison. Most of these massive institutions were abandoned and left to decay. Some were demolished, others were converted into shopping centres or luxury condos. But many still stand empty, slowly being reclaimed by nature, their broken windows like hollow eyes staring out at a world that has moved on. What strikes me most about these places isn't the ghost stories, it's the human stories. Every paranormal account represents a real person who suffered, who was forgotten, who died alone and afraid. The voices that investigators claim to hear in these empty halls are echoes of people who were never allowed to have a voice in life. Mary, the patient we met at the beginning of this video, was a real person. She had hopes and dreams before she was committed. She had a family who might have loved her if society had given them the chance. When we talk about these places being haunted, we're really talking about the weight of injustice, the lingering effects of cruelty, and the ghosts of a system that failed its most vulnerable people. The paranormal activity at these locations serves as a reminder that we can't just abandon the past and expect it to disappear. The spirits of these places, whether you believe in them literally or metaphorically, demand that we remember, that we acknowledge the suffering that occurred, and that we do better. Today, we have a much better understanding of mental health, and while our system is far from perfect, the days of chaining people in basements and performing lobotomies with ice picks are behind us. But these abandoned asylums remain as monuments to what happens when society turns its back on the vulnerable. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, these places are undeniably haunted. Haunted by history, by injustice, by the memories of thousands of people who deserved better than they got. The next time you hear a ghost story about an abandoned asylum, remember that behind every supernatural tale is a very human story of suffering and loss. As these buildings continue to crumble and fade, it's important that we don't let the stories of the people who lived and died in them fade as well. They may be gone, but their spirits, in whatever form they take, remind us that some wounds run too deep to heal, and some voices refuse to be silenced. The darkness in these places isn't supernatural, it's historical, and that perhaps is the most frightening truth of all. What do you think? Have you ever visited one of these abandoned asylums? Share your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark history of psychiatric hospitals, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations into the forgotten corners of history. Ring the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos. Thanks for watching, and remember, the most terrifying monsters are often the ones that walk among us, not the ones hiding in the shadows. I'll see you in the next one.